Good morning. Stahl with Secure the Village here. Welcome to our webinar. Once again, we'll be talking about the California Consumer Privacy Act. This time we'll be talking about data privacy management with my two guests who you'll meet in just a moment. But before we do that, want to remind you all, so as I get the slides right, there we go, that this webinar is brought to you by my company, Citadel Information Group, and also the Pepperdine Grazer Business School and their very innovative CYRP program. And I'm very pleased to announce that we are having our second annual Cybersecure LA conference. It's this year, the theme will be cybersecurity as a team sport. That's a joint presentation of Secure the Village and Pepperdine, and it's October 17th, 2019. So please mark your calendars for that. We'll look forward to seeing everybody there on the 17th of October. So I'm the guide, Stan Stahl, founder of Secure the Village and also the president of Citadel Information Group, an information security management firm. And my guests this month are two people, Ilanna Bavli, who's the president of 1111 Counsel and Strategy, and David Grazer. Both Ilanna and David are very active in Secure the Village. Ilanna's on the board and David's part of the Leadership Council. Ilanna, why don't you say a few words about who you are and what you're about and those things?
Sure. Unfortunately, what I do does not lend itself to an easy elevator speech, but I try to explain it as quickly as possible. So I'm basically a former movie studio in-house lawyer turned investigative security consultant who takes my experience being an in-house transactional lawyer and my investigative experience as well, and serves clients both in and out of the entertainment industry and startups to more established companies as well, in a variety of areas, including helping them secure and protect their content and their data, as well as entering into wise agreements, and really trying to take a business-minded approach unique to each client in all of those endeavors. When it comes to data privacy, it's really a focus of taking that background to really helping understand what's happening, ask the right questions, knowing how to ask those questions, and being able to catch every single detail and map it out. So that's where
That's cool.
That's what I do in this space.
Yeah. Yeah, and that whole point that you're talking about, that whole business approach, because that's one of the things we have to do with security and privacy. That's part of the impact, I think, of these webinars is to help do that. What's reasonable, what's commercially reasonable, that whole set of questions and so on. David, jump in, tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, so hello everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. Hopefully this is a fun, exciting topic for everyone to discuss. But I'm a privacy and security practitioner. I'm a former consultant, and I currently work as a technical program manager in-house at a tech company here in Orange County.
Cool, very good. So let's jump in. Our topics this month, we're going to go over an overview of CCPA, the privacy overview, look at objectives, look at the data inventory. That's fundamental to all of this. So we'll talk about getting started. We'll look at some elements of it. We'll talk about developing the data inventory, documenting it, use of tools, and some of the challenges as well, both in tools, but other challenges in kind of complying with the California Consumer Privacy Act. The background on this, if you missed last month's webinar, that's available on the Secure the Village resource kit, and you can get to that at securethevillage.org. And this also relates to the information classification and control webinar that we had last August. I mean, if you look at the security side of classification and control, knowing what your information is, who decides who has rights to access it and those kinds of things, and you look at the privacy pieces that we're going to get into today, you find those very, very complementary. So I call your attention to that webinar last August as well as a piece of this. Jumping in, the next slide, as soon as I can get it up here, it's on the screen. There we go. This is a slide from last month. We just just picked up that slide, highlighted 4 areas which we want to just briefly discuss that are appropriate for today's discussion. And Ilanna, as the attorney in the group, you want to jump in and talk about these rights that CCPA gives to consumers?
Sure, no problem. So the CCPA gives consumers the right to request that request information about the categories and the specific pieces of personal information that were collected, stored, sold, disclosed by a company, and it allows that request going back 12 months. And that's one distinction from something like GDPR. It also has a very broad right of deletion and an opt-out right as well. It applies to for-profit businesses. There's various, as you can see on the slide, different qualifications to assess when determining whether a company would fall under it. And it does include a right to be compensated in the event of a breach, including a private right of action. As many people know, there are a lot of amendments currently pending, as well as regulations to be issued. And among the amendments are ones that might expand the right of action to include more than just an event of breach. So right now we're in a stage where it could be an even broader issue, this private right of action. It could be any type of breach. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you're following the law and not just thinking about what might happen if there was a breach. But
Sure.
so when it comes to why we're discussing data inventory here, it's unlike GDPR. Here, there's not a specific you must do some kind of data map, data inventory statement in the law. It's understood that you would really need to do that in order to comply, in order to know whether to offer an opt-out, in order to know how to respond within 45 days, which is what's required to a request for disclosure. So it's still a really essential part of compliance.
Yeah, I think that's fundamental to it. David, you've done some research on the law carves out some exceptions, HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
And just the nature of that carve out seems to be, again, there's so much subtlety in this law and so much
Yeah.
uncertainty and ambiguity. What's your sense in the research you've done in this area?
Yeah, I mean, and full disclosure to everyone, I'm not a practicing attorney. I'm a tech person
Yes.
who plays a lawyer on TV, I guess. But I mean, I think the big piece is that a lot of the conversation has been if we're having to work with GLBA or HIPAA, we're covered by that we're kind of in the clear in a certain sense for CCPA, and we don't have to do some of this work. And really what, a lot of the examination needs to be is the whole information life cycle, kind of where we are when, what is actually covered under the law, because that's the specific piece. When you talk about GLBA, it's talking specifically about the financial transactions. And obviously there are ways that you could make, a legal argument to define that. But for the most part, the guidance is going to continue to be understanding that that doesn't necessarily excuse the marketing, the data you gather from marketing, everything up until the financial transaction. And that's going to be, and I think Ilanna and I will talk about this, but it's a case-by-case basis. You have to look at your organization and how you deal with that type of information. But understanding that just because there is a stated exception does not mean that every type of data that you hold is going to exempt you from having to deal with CCPA. You just have to look at it, you have to look at the expanse of your compliance and regulatory requirements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think your point absolutely right on. I mean, Ilanna, you're the attorney here. David is not. I certainly am not. And so that's one piece of this. This is not legal advice, so to speak, at all. And at the
Thank
same
you.
time, what you alluded to, Ilanna, that CCPA is still very, very much in flux. We just published a story last week again of motions in the state legislature to change it. And as I look at the news on this, and I'm sure you see the same thing, we're looking at motions to strengthen the law, and we're looking at motions to weaken the law. And there's really a battle going on here in the legislature, very much is between big business and consumers. We're certainly, as two groups, not yet on the same page. That said, businesses have got to be prepared for a request to disclose or delete, uh, or opt out even. I mean, that's not on here. And the quote is from Robert Braun, who, if you've been following these webinars, Robert's been a regular guest on these webinars. He was on last month on the legal side of GDPR. And one of the things he wrote in his company's blog on security is understanding how the company collects, processes, transmits, and stores data, as well as how it's used and who uses it, is the foundation of a data privacy program and the key to complying with the Act and most other privacy regulations. And Ilanna, you want to jump in and just begin the discussion on this slide? What do we got to do here?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as basically the bottom line, and just to try to simplify everything, is you just really want to know, what you have, where it is, how you got it, from whom you got it, who manages it, why you have it, how long you keep it, to whom you provide access, whether you're getting some kind of a consideration for that access, whether it's monetary or not. And how you're securing it, how you're deleting it. So all of those pieces of information are going to be essential to any kind of data mapping endeavor, data inventory endeavor.
Yeah,
Right.
and the one thing, and Stan, if I may, the one thing I would jump in and say is that that's also in an economy that is basically run by data. I mean, essentially that is where we are. This is really, and this is a big piece that, I drive internally at my company, is that this is good business too. Having a strong understanding of where and what you have, just beyond your compliance requirements. You wanna obviously stay within the law and stay within those rights, but to be able to leverage data to gain the insights, to go through and innovate and go through your strategic objectives, meet those objectives. Having an understanding of this is really key. And then the more detailed and granular that you can be about your data inventory, your classification levels and the controls around them, the more benefit you're going to be able to have, for yourself as well as your customer base.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing you say, yeah, Ilanna, please. I see
yeah,
you got it.
Yeah, I think it's important. Any kind of process like this is really going to also just bring your employees and everyone, into this team effort, and to really get us, everyone will have a stake in the greater security objectives of the company. And, it also helps people behave more efficiently. I think when you go through this type of process, you really start to understand where there's some inefficiencies going on and where things are repeated. And I think it helps people, and as David was saying, on so many different levels from a business perspective beyond compliance.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say as well. I mean, we see on the security side, which is of course where we're more, we're more practiced, if you will, on the security side, but it's the same thing. I mean, the better you understand what information you've got, who's managing, who owns it, in that sense of who has the authority to decide who has access to it, the better you understand the processes that move this information around from department to department or organization to organization, the more control you have in making sure that the third parties you share it with are properly protecting it. The better you do those things, that comes back to you as a return on investment that in some ways is not easily calculable, but it's certainly there in a greater efficiency on the security side and fewer breaches, in those breaches being less costly when they do happen, because you can get more easily get your arms around these kinds of things. I mean, I think these are good objectives, even if there were no law. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this slide before we kind of move on?
Into the meat of it.
What's that? Yeah. Okay, so then let's talk about the life cycle. You'd mentioned that phrase, David, earlier, but it's like, okay, so we know what we want to do. That's what the objectives are about. How do we go about doing it in a real world kind of scenario? David, you want to start on this, because you live in this space much more than, kind of like day in, day out.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yes.
So I mean, there's a million ways that I think that you can go about it. I think one of the key things is really understanding the culture of your organization. I think you'll hear a lot of that today, and I think you'll hear a lot of it moving forward in terms really of just security and privacy in general. Is it's based on culture. If you don't have a culture that really has an interest in this, it's going to be harder and harder to maintain it. So you can go and find an inventory, but you know, not everyone's necessarily going to comply with your internal policies, and that's a risk in and of itself. But what we've seen, what I've seen, is pretty helpful. Is some organizations have a very clear understanding. Going back to if you have been required to stay, within, PCI or GLBA or HIPAA, any of these standard acronyms that we all kind of know in this world, you probably have a decent understanding or a good jumping off point for all the information or the data that you have in place. But if you don't, really what you can do is kind of start thinking about it in general terms, just based on what your business does, how you guys operate, getting, general categories that we may have. And then even going, I think this may be on a different slide, but getting to, just a systems inventory is even helpful before you get to a granular level, because there are tools out there that allow you to run API calls or whatever around, based off a system that kind of can help meet some of these requirements. But getting to a general level and then going in and gathering with some deeper questions, I think is a great jumping off point. And at least it starts the conversation and actually can take a lot of the burden off maybe some of your SMEs, your database administrators or whatever, from having to unearth every piece of data or data type that they may have within their systems, and they're really just validating something. Because if at the end of the day, really that's what we need, that's our requirements. We have to validate that exists to actually start creating this inventory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ilanna?
Yeah, sometimes, and I think that sometimes the biggest challenge, it's usually easier to figure out what systems you have. But the understanding what data you have can be the biggest challenge, to get it out of people, or to
Sure.
obtain it through tools.
Yeah.
And what's key here, I think I really want to focus on for CCPA is that the biggest challenge is making sure that you're covering all of the different potential categories that can be covered. Because a lot of people will just think about the usual, the name, address, and social security number, date of birth, credit card information, email addresses, health information. But the CCPA is extremely broad. So on a couple different levels here. So I'll get into some of the nitty gritty here about the definition of personal information, and under those, the various categories that you would have to put things into. So first of all, it will include both like persons, and at the moment it still refers to also household as well, which is an interesting concept. And I believe one of the amendments that's passed committee would try to get rid of that concept. And also at the moment from a big picture level, consumers is defined very broadly right now. And there's an amendment that also passed committee that would try to narrow it so it would exclude employees, agents, job applicants, people who, when information was collected just for that purpose, then that would be excluded as well. So that would be a huge threshold decision. However that turns out will help govern just how broad certain companies have to go in this endeavor. So aside from that, then as far as the categories of data, so beyond name, address, et cetera, on the digital level, there's online activity. There's everything from, IP address to unique digital identifiers used in the marketing world to, device identifiers to browsing history. There's such things as purchasing history, just like consumer behavior, both the actual history of what you might have purchased, as well as what might be extrapolated from that, developing a consumer profile, any inferences from the data. those type of things are covered as well. On the biometric definition is very broad. We're not just talking about a thumbprint or something, you know, we're talking about voice recordings from which you can extract a voice print. We're talking about gait patterns, sleep exercise data. It's extremely broad definition. So employment information, educational information, it's huge. So one of the big challenges is when you're planning this out and you're planning the questions that you're going to go to your employees on, it's, you know, making sure that you're, you know, covering the easy stuff and conveying to them, you know, just all these different, you know, elements and different things that they might have, no one might have thought about that might be relevant, that they might actually have been collecting. And a manager may not know this, but someone lower level might, and we'll get to that later as far as, you know, how you go about getting this information. But I think that here in particular, that's just one of the really key things. And yes, the language may get refined as we go through the year, before enforcement starts. But for now, it is extremely broad.
Yeah. So am I even hearing in what you said, both of you, in some sense? So, I mean, if you go back to the Cambridge Analytica situation, where you've got a company that is now getting data, forget whether legitimately or illegitimately, you got a company that's getting data, and they're making inferences from that data about the nature of the people whose data that's been collected from. Those inferences now also become part of the information that has to be protected, there's privacy implications to that.
Yeah, because we would, Ilanna, you would define that as the reasonable link to a consumer profile, and I think that's the actual language as it sits right now, and I think it's unique language, but I think it's actually pretty truthful to the way that a lot of organizations are using data today. They're trying to extract an insight, and the one thing I was going to say is that while the definitions are broad, and that's kind of what we're seeing that really across the board, you know, in terms of like international regulations in Canada, Brazil, all across there. So those, I feel like the definition is kind of becoming a little bit more standardized. At least that's my opinion on that. But I think what it also enables you to do, because if you are solely a privacy or a security practitioner, you're not necessarily always informed of everything that's going on in your organization, and having to ask some of these broad questions that kind of like, you know, what are we doing with this type of information? Why do we need this type of an event that's happening on our website? Can we aggregate that data, or do we need it down to a personalized level to personalize the experience? Those are conversations that enable you just to, again, beyond just CCPA and beyond some of your other compliance requirements, get a firm understanding of your potential risks so that you can actually control and actually go to really what is going to help you maintain all this is to build programs that really combine both privacy and security to kind of manage this at scale. Because that's, I think, really where you have to get to, because if we don't get a federal law, and we don't have to debate that, this is still going to be patchwork, and you're going to worry about Washington. You know, no one talks about Colorado as much as they should. There's stuff going on in Oregon as well. So if we don't deal with it at scale and ask these kind of broad questions to get a firm understanding, we're going to have trouble kind of pivoting from compliance requirement to compliance requirement. And that's just going to create fatigue.
Operationally.
I think it's important to look big picture. I mean, because we are in a big time of change with big data, and a lot of, you know, this particular matter of the part of it that refers to inferences drawn from the information, the psychological trends, abilities, aptitudes, behavior, predispositions. That's what this is all about, and everyone's trying to make money off of it. And I think, so on the one hand, if it's something that's not really essential to what a company is doing, it might give you know, a company organization thought as to whether it is important to be doing this. But if it is, I mean, the law recognizes that there is value in gathering this data. And it does, though it does, we didn't talk about this, but it does say that a company can't discriminate against a consumer for opting out and not sharing their data. It actually does specifically allow them to say that if there is reasonable benefit by
Public
obtaining
benefit,
that data, they can offer a discount. They can, there's benefits that can be offered to the consumer actually. So even though big picture wise, it's supposed to not do that, in the end it does. And so a company, that is really needing to collect these digital identifiers and monitor behavior, and that's really essential to what they're doing or otherwise important. It's okay to be, for that to be folded in. They just need to obviously do it in a secure way, be prepared to respond to all the disclosure requests, and be very clear in their opt-in and how they're doing it. And for the people that are opting out will understand that they're not able to access this specific kind of benefit or discount or extra deal that they're going to get for doing that. But at least the law does allow, from a business perspective, you to still keep doing this. It's not going to try to shut the door.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that seems to me to be one of these things about the opt-out. I mean, it's a trade-off, if you will, that if I'm not opted out, let's say with YouTube, for example, and YouTube keeps track of the fact that I like to watch little bits of old comedies from the 1960s and 70s. So as I finish one, it suggests another one. You like this, you might like that. If I opt out, I give up that. If you like this, then you might like this situation. It seems so. There's clear trade-offs here for the consumer. It's not an automatic opt-out that way.
Yeah, and that's definitely a deviation from, and I think it's a more practical deviation from a lot of the interpretations with GDPR and CCPA.
Yeah.
Is that, you have to allow people to have the service without repercussions. And I think maybe that's part of the discrimination, right? But it's not, I think, everything.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Any other thoughts on this slide before we move to we start looking at some of the details, the devil's in the details kind of situation? Yeah. So let's go there. This is a chart from the Daily Journal. They had a conference on their annual cybersecurity conference a couple of months ago, and a lot of it was focused, of course, on CCPA. So this was kind of the view from the attorney's perspective, if you will. And one of the charts that they passed out was looking at data inventory across a number of different components, if you will. And I found this chart, as a non-attorney, as a practitioner in the field, so to speak, of actually doing data inventories, I found this chart very interesting because of kind of just the way it's structured and laid out, and it takes things down to several levels of detail. What are your thoughts on this? Ilanna, you're the attorney, so maybe you want to jump in first.
I think this just helps you get a big picture, like this is the universe of what we're talking about here,
exactly.
of what an inventory will involve, not necessarily in order, but you're talking about the data subjects, where it's coming from. You're talking about the subject matter experts in your organization, who are going to know more about the processing and of the data and what's happening to it, whether it's being sold, the actual transfers themselves, what kind of third parties are they going to? Do you have agreements with these third parties that are going to comply, that are going to protect you? Is it going to be something that could be deemed a sale, something of value, which I didn't mention already? The sale is not only monetary, it's monetary. It could be other kinds of benefit, which could be so broad. So, this kind of gives you a picture, the types of records, which is very important. That's another, a distinction from GDPR, I believe, is the understanding that you're having to categorize everything and give people categories of this and categories of that. So there's a category, there's this this 12-month window, there's a few other exceptions there, the elements of the data, obviously, and the sources. So it just gives you a good sense of this is what we're talking about. And then we got to kind of put things in order as we then launch into the actual data inventory process.
Yeah, exactly. David?
I mean, I think Ilanna hit most of it. I mean, it illustrates the ecosystem, and it illustrates the complexity with what we're doing. And One thing that I would say is that I've always used these exercises as kind of an excuse to build your champions committee. So kind of explaining and selling the value, the business value of privacy and security, and designing controls around the transferring of data, how we deal with third parties, how we actually procure systems, and integrate them and provide access to them. Gaining that kind of understanding and putting it in business terms, I think is really valuable, and you can do that while you're kind of meeting with all of these great parts of your organization, because we shouldn't tell marketing that they can't have that information, but they will, on the flip side, can be an incredible advocate for developing or engendering your customer trust, and that's long-term retention and long-term brand equity. So I think that's the thing that I would point out in terms of this.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I think so much of the key here is about it can be most successful in many different ways for an organization if this is approached not as a strict compliance or audit type of exercise, but something really collaborative, in which you're going to go and sit down with marketing and kind of understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, why it's important to keep doing it, but then just collaboratively and in a very friendly way get to a deeper understanding of what we're doing, what they are doing, so that you can create the inventory and really involve them in it, and it be a very collaborative process is what's key here. They don't, no one and that's, I think we'll probably get into that, but that's one of the big, things is that, people want to hold on to the information. They're scared if it comes at them as a, very auditing, and, they're scared they're going to say no to things. They're not going to give you answers. They're not going to, so this has to be a really, it has to be a special approach to handling something like this.
Well, and that's a good point, and it actually takes us to this next slide, which is kind of how do you develop it. And what you're both saying, and this is probably what I find so fascinating in this, if you will, that it's the same with cybersecurity as it is with data privacy. It's the same things. It's much of it on the slide. We're now talking about it, so to speak. But it's this whole idea that as you begin to do this, as you begin to pull this process together and looking at the inventory, and you're talking with people, you really have the opportunity to better understand your business. And in better understanding your business, you can now provide services more effectively, more efficiently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that way.
Definitely.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, David, why don't you jump in, and because you talked about the data champions, and this is, I think, a good slide to begin expanding on that point.
Sure. So, obviously, I think the best way that this is done is first of all, if this is something you haven't done in your organization, and I think a lot of us have had to scope in pieces of GDPR, just kind of based on the organization and the way that the economy works at this point. So we've had those EU data subjects in our databases for a while. So we've actually had to play with that. But really, making sure that there's leadership buy-in, and not just the technical, not just the CISO or the CIO or the CTO, but getting buy-in from the CEO, and the COO and the chief digital officers and data officers, or whoever you can, to come at it kind of from cross-functional leadership, multiple prongs. I think that really gets people at the subject matter expert level, which is, it's a not necessarily a lower level, but they're not at the leadership level potentially. And it gets them involved and kind of, lights a fire to answer some of these questions, because, the truth of the matter is that you can create the inventory and get everything in place, but with the complexity of data today and the way that we actually, gain those insights, like we gain the consumer profile and, and really give people some diagnostic benefit, if you're in healthcare, there's a complexity to the data pipeline. I mean, the literal infrastructure and the taxonomy and the modeling that goes into this is not, it's not to be to be laughed at. It's a very serious conversation that will result in many more conversations about we need this data for X and we have to protect it by Y, and you have to have those conversations. So having that leadership buy-in at the top is really important to make sure that it gets prioritized effectively. And really making sure that I think Ilanna has a good point of view on the way you adapt your process based on your culture, and I think you have to be case by case. But I've always taken an approach that you should be leveraging technology as well as I call it digital analog. You should be having interviews because you start breaking down those silos in those interviews, not just by running, a data discovery scan that's native to SQL or whatever you're utilizing.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the book several years ago, High Tech, High Touch. That this is one of those places where that combination is so important. Yeah, Ilanna, jump in. What do you?
Yeah, and that's one of the things is that it's not, well, I know we'll talk a little bit later about tools and the technical side of things, but it's important, both to combine that with the answering the human questions, and on the human side to know that just sending out a questionnaire is not necessarily going to cut it, and that's where a lot of this cultural question comes in, and what David was talking about buy-in from leadership and cross-functional collaborative cooperation. I think that that applies to middle management as well. So I think one thing that's important is that you're getting answers from people at all levels, because you just send a questionnaire to the head of a department, which some people might think is satisfactory. You're not going to find out where everything's happening. And if you, and even or same thing if you even just speak to them in person. And then when you're speaking to the people on their team, it's really important to know that they have the cooperation from their manager and not the feeling that they're going to get punished in some way for breaking the rules. I mean, there needs to be this kind of understanding from the top and from the middle management that, hey, we get it, that you're in order to achieve the business objectives and to do your job, you might have made some decisions along the way that might be contrary to what IT is telling you to do. And, you might be saving something onto your hard drive, even though we tell you not to, or, you might have printed something out, you might have done this, you might have done that. And for this process to be really open, saying this isn't about punishing anybody, just be open about this, and we want to give people comfort. And when you're interviewing them, I mean, that's the thing I have found in my experience. There have been times in which of course nobody does this, and of course I would never do that, and and sometimes you're sitting down with someone and then they start to feel a little more comfortable, like, oh, you know what, yeah, I do that in order to, this is why, but I'm going to change it, but there just needs to be that,
Right.
that sometimes that happens. And so that's why the sitting down one-on-one part, can be so important. And just really speaking in a, someone who can speak to someone at a very comfortable level and understand what they're doing and why they did it. They had good reason for doing it. And I think that's really key. And the same thing that helps, another thing that I find that helps people open up is the collaboration on it. So that it's not just, hand them a list of questions and answer it and just follow up with it. It's not just that initial interview, if you do one, but it's follow up. It's, hey, okay, now we've mapped it out. We'll get to the discussion about, visual data flow diagrams and that, showing it to them. A lot of people really like that. They're the best person to see if something got missed, because that will help. Some people are very visual, like I am, and they're going to want to, once they see it, then they'll say, oh, you know what, I forgot about this. And we also get something here. And so going back and making them a part of the process, and it becomes like you're creating something as a team, like as David talked about as well. I think that's an essential aspect of it as well. So everyone has buy-in in the final version, and they're all a part of it.
Yeah, I think absolutely true what you're talking about. And when we look at this as well, it's at the one level, it's got to be leadership driven. If management is not behind it, just people are going to not treat it with the seriousness that it requires. That's also a plug for the first 2 webinars we did going back more than a year ago. The first one was on leadership. The second was on that leadership level management that has to happen. Cross-functional collaborative. Again, watch the webinars. They're all about the creation of a leadership team with, in the security language, the information security manager is a part of that. That's an executive or directly reports to an executive. All of that structure that's in the first dozen or so of these webinars just flows into this. Well, how do you do this? You do it that same way we've been talking about it. I also like, and you both alluded to it, it's the point on the chart, follow up and dig deep. Oftentimes you get started, you get an idea, you begin to flesh it out. Now you've got to go back, and when you do that, people will remember things or understand things differently than when they first saw it, and those aha moments have the opportunity to surface. So yeah, I think you know what you're both saying is absolutely right on here. I want to jump ahead. Okay, so all right, we developed the data inventory. What's it look like? How do we document it? You know, and so on. And so this chart just gives one example of basically a spreadsheet. It's up at the top of it. You know, information category, who the information belongs to. The examples we've got are customers and contractors, a description of the information, what department owns it, how, where, when it's collected, where is it transferred, departments, third parties, what's the nature of that transfer? Is it being done for business? Like when we use MailChimp, we transfer information to MailChimp. They now have it, but it's only a transfer provisionally. We're not selling it to MailChimp. Yeah. What's the retention period? Let's spend a couple of minutes talking about this. And in particular, that last bullet, we've never talked yet on this hour about the retention period. That piece of it. So how do we show this stuff? There's some language there. What's your experience with that? And talk about the retention period matter as well.
Yeah, I'll jump off and Ilanna, you jump in. You know, I think, and I would point out that the other piece that we don't have on this slide is also taking a look at, you know, the legal basis for the processing. Was consent given freely, or just gaining that kind of insight is also really important, because that also kind of frames if you have any, you know, exceptions or anything like that that are going to help speed up your, you know, the validation of these requests that you're going to get. And a lot of that language, I think a lot of people recognize from GDPR, but, you know, GDPR is becoming a standard. So if you want a guidance, GDPR and how some of these, you know, these other laws and these adequacy decisions have come down, they are aligning a lot to that. And there's a lot of good baseline tactics, you know, tactical things that you can do. So I wouldn't shy away from, you know, taking some you know, cherry picking from there into your CCPA work. But in terms of retention, I mean, it's that in itself is a very complex conversation, where legal has to drive, these are the absolute requirements that we have in terms of financial records, employee records, you know, especially if you're giving your employees health benefits, you know, just how long do we have to keep these things on board? And then you can start classifying and then defining some, you know, retention speeds, or timelines against that. I mean, the other piece is that as you develop and understand the systems that you have in place, beyond just the classification, there may be some systems that you want to tighten up your retention, you know, depending on, you know, any collaborative communication tools or anything like that, anything that could just propagate more personal information that you would have to go and find. Those are areas where you'd want to kind of tighten up based on the system level, some of your retentions. You know, and maybe it's also talking about speeding up your backups. You know, if you're not backing up daily, you know, or doing anything that's like active on your database, maybe you want to, so you can start, you know, protecting that information a little bit more and getting it off, you know, getting it into more protected locations potentially, depending on what your controls are.
That's a good point as well. Yeah, Ilanna, you're. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So on the retention, first of all, as far as determining the retention criteria, as a former in-house lawyer, I know what it's like. The lawyers get to say, you can only keep this. You're going to delete all email after 6 months. We're going to do this or that. And then the people that are doing the work, including sometimes lawyers themselves, are like, wait, no, we can't do that. We need access to it. So
Yeah.
a lot of it is a collaborative business and legal discussion. So and in so much of this, it's the compliance team, the lawyers might say this, and then but from a business perspective, there's might be some reason why some risk should be taken, and they come to some kind of middle ground. So I do think, first of all, as between the legal and management, there should be some kind of more of a collaboration there, and legal needs to understand that sometimes they might choose to take some risks that are necessary for the business, and business needs to understand that they've got to listen to legal too, and and that can be a very interesting dance. And as far as the retention, because it's, we've talked about this being a CCPA, there being this 12-month look back. So that's something that kind of help. You want to keep that in mind as you're doing the inventory, and also need to understand how something is being deleted. So I would add that as well. I can't remember I'm not sure if it's on there, but the just what's happening at the end. How are you deleting it? And that's something to really and getting into the nitty gritty, like as far as the third parties, I like how as you see, it talks about like the nature of the transfer. What are you getting from it? What kind of benefit might you be getting? And then the third party, whether that person is going to be certified. There's something in the law about some kind of certification, that they're not going to further transfer it and sell it, and they're going to agree to comply with certain restrictions, and then that might keep you let you avoid having to disclose, like if it's a regular vendor that's always going to be working on this and not really going to be selling it to anybody else, but they're just doing a little bit of processing for you, then that helps. It's a lot less onerous than the GDPR in that respect. But going to the big picture about documenting, what I wanted to say is, however you choose to do it, which is going to be a discussion, it might be unique to your organization, it might be whether or not your CEO is very visual, is going to want like a big set of beautiful maps, or whether they're not, and they might want to focus on a report and spreadsheets. Usually it's great to have both in some way. There's certain things that really help to be done visually, like in any event, a network diagram map is usually going to be important on that front. And we'll see in the next slide. I know we'll talk about a little bit another example on the visual front, but you want to make sure that you are getting all the information down, and you can't always fit it all into a spreadsheet with little cells, and you can't always fit it all onto a map. So another important thing is to have some kind of accompanying narrative, accompanying report of some set, that will fill in the blanks, that might then explain something about the nature of that relationship with the third party and what kind of agreements might be in place, or details about the sources and the security that's being used. You don't want, as much as you can get onto the main spreadsheet or diagram is fabulous, but you sometimes really do need some kind of an accompanying report. You definitely want to have that in hand, especially in case the worst happens. You want to be able to show that you were implementing reasonable security and you were doing these kinds of things and getting a hand. This is all part of that. I'm sure we haven't talked about very much, but these are steps that you're taking, showing that you're on top of everything. So the more that you document and the better on that front, and also to respond, in the event there is some kind of a breach. It's just knowing your workflows is invaluable. I just can't tell you how many times I've dealt with, some kind of movie or TV show content leak, spoiler leak, whatnot, in which you're having to kind of go back and recreate. Oh, wait, who had what, when, where did it come from? And that's just not aside from the personal data front. It happens a lot in my practice. But you just want to know what's happening. That way you can very quickly figure out where something might have gone wrong, where who might have opened up a phishing email, who might what it really is incredibly helpful when it comes to the incident response practices as well.
Yeah, and moving to the next slide, you just alluded to it, the data mapping as well. So this takes, and this is more of a view across the organization of how this information flows, so you can begin to, again, it's allows you to manage it better, even in the absence of CCPA, I would think.
Correct.
Yeah. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we're coming up to the top of the hour. Want to move on to the subject of tools, because there are a lot of tools out there. And we've just alluded to something as simple as a spreadsheet, but there are also special purpose tools. And David, you want to kind of begin to talk us through this slide?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of tools out there. I would say that because of GDPR, well, I mean, even before GDPR, but there's been a large kind of upswing in the privacy tech space. So the IAPP, IAPP.org, like Stan has there on the slide, they put out a tech vendor report every year, which is extremely comprehensive. It's, their version maybe of like a Gartner type of thing. And it provides a lot of good tools, a lot of good insight. A lot of them are things that we've seen in the past, maybe GRC tools or what have you. But then there are also very specific subject access request tools that help map back and manage that process, and third party risk, and another big piece and something that everyone has to manage. But the other thing I would say is that each company has to identify how they want to adopt, or if they want to adopt a new tool. But depending on what you have in your infrastructure, I mean, SQL, AWS has launched, a new service called Macy. It's only going after the S3 part of your environment at this point, but it has classification capabilities. So there's a lot of native leveraging that you can do just in more of a modern infrastructure that a lot of organizations kind of are keeping up to date. So I would do that. I would work with, part of these conversations you're having is maybe that you're going to gain more of that systems inventory, and you can kind of identify what types of tools that they have natively built in. MailChimp and a few others, they've built GDPR specific tools that you can leverage for these types of activities. So just, something to keep in mind when you look
Sure.
at when you look at tools.
Yeah, and things to be aware of. Yeah.
You want to make sure that you're not leaving out the human piece, first of all. Like, a lot of the decision about how you're going to go about this is going to depend on the type of organization you have, the type of staff you have. Is this a law firm with a big age range of people with different types of cultures and practices and fax machines and file cabinets, or is this a really young startup full of millennials that are just on computers and there's no paper anywhere? Because part of the CCP does cover things that aren't collected online as well. So, you're going to want to see what kind of organization you have, find a way to get at that human element and that non-online element, and whether or not how much you rely on tools, as well as especially when it comes to picking a tool. If you are an organization that is likely to have to respond to the actual disclosure requests and opt-out requests regularly, then one of the tools that allows you to do all of it and keeps it all in a centralized location in the cloud, that you're going to be able to automatically process the requests and also be able to prepare the maps, that might be something for you. And the good thing about the IAPP report is that it does show like the long list of tools that can help you on data mapping and data inventory, but then there's a little chart with little bullets. You can then see, oh, they also offer this, that, and the other things, so that you can find the right type of tool, hopefully for you, as far as what your needs might be. But you don't want to overboard, like if it's a tool bloat. You don't want to do, you want to really be careful, and you don't want to throw a lot of wasted money on this. You want to pick the thing that's really right for you.
And again, with security in general, and I would imagine it's the same in privacy, there's a real opportunity to throw a lot of money at tools when it's not the tools, it's the management that becomes the important thing, and that's much less expensive. You start throwing money at tools, and all of a sudden your costs can go way up, and unnecessarily so. We find, particularly in the mid-market and smaller companies, I mean, the bigger you are, I think the better able you are to take advantage of these kinds of tools. The greater the need is to do that as well. Any other thoughts on this chart before we move on? So this is the kind of the last slide. We've already talked somewhat about challenges, but we wanted to have one kind of final, let's bring all the challenges together at one place so we can kind of finish up talking about the challenges, because it's always the devil's in the details, and that sort of thing is always what's at risk here when we start putting this stuff together. And we kind of broke up the challenges as we were putting this webinar together into systemic challenges that go across an organization, and then there's just challenges that, by God, we're all human, and so we're going to react to this stuff in those kinds of ways. Yeah, jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we did.
Yeah, go for it, Ilanna.
Yeah, I think we did cover, as you said, I think we covered a lot of it as we were going through the other slides. That some of the biggest things to remember, aside from the the politics of it, when it comes to the different systemic challenges, organizational challenges, and the human aspect of it, the fear, the wanting to keep the information to yourself, the not being asked the right questions to really to get the right answers are all issues. The shadow IT that's going on, and the inability to find out that it's going on. Those are all things that come up, and I think from the ground, if you think about these things as you're planning it from the ground up, you can hopefully avoid many of them. David, sorry.
No, that was
Last word.
that was pretty much all. Yeah, that was all I would say. Shadow IT and your third parties. I think everyone, if they work hard enough, can obviously get a pretty granular data inventory and get your data flows done, and your network topology diagrams. That stuff will sort itself out within your own organization. It's just paying attention to what is also outside. Paying attention to the threat landscape, and one of those biggest is going to be within your supply chain versus your system supply chain, but also the supply chain that exists within your application, your actual technical stack. And it's just making sure that you have all those key pieces in place. Everyone that you're kind of adopting into your organization, I think, is a big just one thing to kind of keep abreast of and stay focused on.
Yeah, that's something else you mentioned, David, as we were preparing for this webinar, is just your language, that it's incumbent on leadership to help explain that this is not just a compliance exercise, but it's a trust and brand equity exercise. And I would add to that as well, I mean, just from my experience on process management, that as you begin to understand your processes, you actually begin to make your processes more effective, more efficient. You end up saving time, saving money, and also, again, that becomes an important piece of this.
Yeah. Very much.
Yeah. Okay, so that kind of wraps up this webinar. And again, David, Ilanna, thank you both. Next month, we're going to take our third deep dive into CCPA. One of the things about the California Consumer Privacy Act is that consumers, or people, or however that language ends up getting finally defined, have a private right of action with statutory damages of between $100 and $750 if their personal information has been compromised by a breach that results from, and this is the key word, a violation of the duty to implement reasonable security procedures and practices. And nobody knows what reasonable is. It's going to be very subjective in the broad, and in the specific instances, what is reasonable, let's say for AT&T, DirecTV, Amazon, blah, 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 and what's reasonable for a small law firm, a small e-commerce company, any manufacturing firm, import, export company, whatever. What's reasonable is going to be very different for those two classes of people, of organizations, if you will. One of the things SecureTheVillage has been doing, and Ilanna and David, you've both been active in helping us do this, is what are the minimum reasonable security practices? What's what's that set of practices such that if you're not doing these things, then your practices are not reasonable, period. Like, there's a floor. You can't go beneath it, no matter how small you are. If you're 25 million or more, you got this kind of data. It's, it would be, if you're not doing this stuff, it's not reasonable. So that's next month. We're going to spend some time talking about it It'll be me, and I'm not sure who my guests are going to be yet. I'm still sorting out, you know, I certainly I need to have an attorney on here and probably somebody with some security expertise as well besides just me. But that'll be our June 6th webinar. It's part of our ongoing monthly webinar series designed to be, quote, practical, real world, how to, actionable. You've seen that today with all the way from the big picture perspective down to, well, here's the way you can begin starting a spreadsheet to actually keep track of this stuff. These are always the first Thursday of the month, 10 a.m. Pacific. They're part of all the things that Secure the Village does to turn people and organizations into cyber guardians. And again, we're so grateful to Ilanna, you being on our board, David, you being on our leadership council, both of you giving so generously of your time today. For more information, you've got contact information on this slide, and please don't hesitate to follow up with Ilanna or David or me. Mark October 17th on your calendar. That's our Cybersecure LA 2019, a joint presentation of Secure the Village and the Pepperdine Grazer Dios Business School. And please follow us, Secure the Village on LinkedIn. You just look up Secure the Village on LinkedIn, and also my own company, Citadel. And Ilanna, if you're on LinkedIn, I'm sure people can follow you as well.
Only
Please
Ilanna
do that.
Bavli, and easy to find.
Okay, look up Ilanna Bavli, easy to find, LinkedIn, connect in with all of us, connect in with David. And with that, any final words, Ilanna, David?
Thank you for having us, Stan.
Thank you.
It's
Yeah,
really
thank you for
great
having
to be a
us. It's
part of
great.
this program.
Super. Well, thank you all, and we are adjourned.